What happens when Hollywood's most respected legend walks into a talk show and gets blindsided by a host who can't keep her opinions to herself? In just 39 seconds, one comment would turn a simple interview into the most explosive television moment of the year, and Joy Behar would learn that some guests don't back down. The studio lights were hot that morning as Clint Eastwood settled into his chair on The View's iconic set. The audience clapped enthusiastically, excited to hear from the acclaimed actor and director. Whoopi Goldberg smiled warmly as she introduced him, listing his incredible achievements in film. Sunny Hostin nodded along, clearly impressed. Sarah Haynes beamed with genuine admiration, but Joy Behar sat with her arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested she had something very different on her mind. Clint sat there in his relaxed manner, the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades in the spotlight. He'd agreed to come on the show to talk about his latest project, a film about American values and personal responsibility. It should have been straightforward. It should have been respectful. But Joy had other plans. Whoopi started with an easy question about his directing process. Clint answered thoughtfully, talking about how he likes to work with actors and create an environment where everyone feels comfortable taking risks. The audience listened intently. Sarah jumped in with a question about his favorite scenes to shoot, and Clint smiled as he shared a funny story from set. Everything was going smoothly. Then Joy leaned forward. "So Clint," she said, her voice dripping with an edge that made the other hosts glance at each other nervously. "Your movies always have these tough guy heroes who solve problems with violence. Don't you think that's a pretty outdated way of looking at the world?" The audience went quiet. Clint paused, clearly taken aback by the hostile tone, but he kept his composure. "Well, Joy, I think you might be oversimplifying things a bit," he said calmly. "My films are about people facing difficult situations and making hard choices. That's not outdated. That's human nature." Joy let out a dismissive laugh that echoed through the studio. "Human nature? Is that what we're calling it now? Because to me, it looks like you're glorifying a bunch of behavior that has no place in today's society." Sunny shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Whoopi tried to jump in. "Joy, maybe we should..." But Joy wasn't done. She talked over Whoopi without even looking at her. "I mean, let's be honest here. Your whole career has been built on playing characters who think they're above the law. Men who think they can just take justice into their own hands. And now you come on here expecting us to celebrate that?" The audience gasped. This wasn't a question. This was an attack. And it was completely unprovoked. Clint's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I think you're confusing the characters I play with who I am as a person, and I think you're missing the point of the stories entirely." "Oh, I don't think I'm missing anything," Joy shot back, leaning even further forward now, her finger pointing across the table. "I think what you make is dangerous. I think it feeds into this whole toxic masculinity problem we have in this country." Sarah's mouth fell open. Sunny looked horrified. Whoopi put her hand up, trying desperately to regain control. "Okay, Joy, I think that's..." "No, let her finish," Clint said quietly, his eyes locked on Joy. "I want to hear what she really thinks." Joy smiled, clearly thinking she'd won something. "What I think is that you've made millions of dollars selling violence to Americans, and now you want to act like you're some kind of artist. But really, you're just part of the problem." The studio was dead silent. Even the cameramen seemed shocked. This had gone way beyond a tough interview. This was personal. This was disrespectful. And everyone could feel it. Clint sat back in his chair and took a slow breath. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but firm. "Joy, I've been in this industry for over 60 years. I've worked with thousands of people. I've told stories that have meant something to millions of viewers around the world. And in all that time, I've never had someone sit across from me and tell me that my life's work is dangerous without even trying to understand it. Well, Maybe nobody's had the courage to tell you the truth before, Joy snapped back. That's when Sunny finally spoke up. Joy, come on. This is inappropriate. Clint is our guest. Joy whipped her head toward Sunny. I'm just asking the questions that need to be asked. Sorry if that makes people uncomfortable. You're not asking questions, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. You're attacking him. Joy rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, please. If he can't handle a little criticism, maybe he shouldn't be making movies that push these kinds of messages. Whoopi raised her voice, something she rarely did. Joy, that's enough. This isn't what we do here. But the damage was done. Clint stood up slowly, removing his microphone with careful, deliberate movements. The audience watched in stunned silence. No one could believe what they were seeing. You know what, Joy? Clint said, his voice carrying across the studio. I came here today to have a conversation. A real conversation about my work, about storytelling, about what it means to create something that challenges people to think. But you didn't want a conversation. You wanted a fight. And I don't do that. Not with people who've already made up their minds. Joy crossed her arms again, her face flushed red. So you're just going to run away because someone disagreed with you? That's pretty weak for a tough guy. The audience gasped again. Several people started booing. This was beyond anything anyone had expected. Clint shook his head slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. No, Joy. I'm leaving because you've been disrespectful from the moment I sat down, and I don't have to sit here and be insulted on national television by someone who clearly has no interest in actually listening. He turned to the other hosts. Whoopi, Sunny, Sarah, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry it turned out this way. Whoopi stood up quickly. Clint, please don't go. We can... It's fine, he said gently, but I think it's best if I leave now. As he started walking toward the exit, Joy couldn't resist one final jab. Typical, a man who makes movies about standing up for what's right, running away when things get a little heated. That made Clint stop. He turned back around, and the look on his face made the entire studio go absolutely silent. When he spoke, every word was measured and clear. Joy, I've faced down more challenges in my life than you could possibly imagine. I've worked in an industry that tried to tear me down more times than I can count. I've dealt with critics who actually knew what they were talking about. But I've never, in all my years, encountered someone so determined to be cruel without cause. You didn't invite me here to have a discussion. You invited me here so you could try to tear me down on camera. And that says a lot more about you than it does about me. The audience erupted in applause. Loud, sustained applause that filled the entire studio. Several people stood up. Joy's face went from red to white as she realized that the audience was completely against her. Sunny was nodding, clearly agreeing with every word Clint said. Sarah had tears in her eyes. Whoopi looked disappointed and frustrated, but not at Clint. She was staring at Joy with an expression that made it clear they would be having words after the show. Joy tried to save face. Oh, so now I'm the bad guy because I asked some tough questions? You didn't ask tough questions, Clint replied calmly. You made accusations. You insulted me. You dismissed my entire career. And you did it all with a smile on your face, like you were proud of yourself. That's not journalism, Joy. That's just mean. The applause got even louder. People were shouting their support for Clint. Someone yelled, "You tell her," from the back of the audience. Joy looked around desperately, trying to find someone on her side, but even the crew members were shaking their heads. She'd crossed a line that everyone could see, and there was no walking it back. I was just trying to have a real conversation, Joy said weakly. No, Whoopi interrupted, her voice firm. You weren't, and we all know it. Clint nodded at Whoopi appreciatively, then addressed the audience directly. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I'm sorry you had to witness this, but I hope you understand why I can't stay. A man has to have some dignity. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Everyone was on their feet now, clapping and cheering as Clint walked toward the exit with his head held high. He moved with the same quiet strength he'd shown in dozens of films, the kind of grace under pressure that had made him an icon. As he reached the door, Sarah called out to him, "Clint, we're so sorry. This isn't who we are." He turned and gave her a genuine smile. "I know, Sarah. Thank you." And then he was gone. The studio doors closed behind him, and the audience was still applauding. The camera operators didn't know what to do. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to figure out how to proceed. This had never happened before. A guest had never walked off the view like this. Whoopi turned to Joy with fire in her eyes. "What were you thinking?" Joy tried to defend herself. "I was just being honest. Someone needed to call him out." "Call him out for what?" Sonny demanded. "For having a successful career? For making movies that people love? For being a legend in his industry? What exactly did he do to deserve that?" The audience was still buzzing, people talking among themselves, clearly upset by what they'd witnessed. Several audience members were shouting at Joy, telling her she'd been wrong, telling her she'd been rude. Sarah wiped her eyes. "That was one of the most respected people in Hollywood, and you just drove him off our show. Do you understand what you've done?" Joy's face was a mixture of defiance and dawning realization. She thought she was being bold. She thought she was asking the tough questions that needed to be asked. But looking at the reactions of her co-hosts, looking at the fury in the audience's eyes, looking at how badly this had all gone, she was starting to understand that she'd made a massive mistake. "I have a right to my opinion," she said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "You have a right to your opinion," Whoopi agreed. "But you don't have the right to ambush a guest. You don't have the right to attack someone who came here in good faith. And you certainly don't have the right to speak to anyone the way you just spoke to him." The audience erupted in agreement. People were chanting, "Shame on Joy!" now. It was getting louder and louder. Joy looked around, seemingly searching for an ally, but found none. Even the producers were signaling frantically to cut to commercial. The show had completely fallen apart. "We need to take a break," Whoopi announced to the camera, her professionalism kicking in despite the chaos. "We'll be right back." As soon as the cameras cut, the studio erupted into chaos. Audience members were standing up, shouting their disapproval at Joy. Several people were demanding their money back for their tickets. Others were recording on their phones, capturing every moment of the aftermath. Sarah was crying openly now. "I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe we just lost Clint Eastwood because of this." Sonny had her head in her hands. That was humiliating. For him. For us. For the entire show. Whoopi was pacing back and forth, trying to control her anger. When she finally spoke to Joy, her words were ice cold. "You've been on this show for years. You know how we do things. You know we treat our guests with respect. But today, you decided that your ego was more important than everything we've built here. And now, we're all going to pay for it." Joy tried one more time to defend herself. "I was trying to hold him accountable." "Accountable for what?" Whoopi snapped. "For being successful? For having different political views than you? For making movies you personally don't like? That's not accountability, Joy. That's just you being petty and cruel." The audience was still riled up. Security had to come in to calm people down. Several audience members were giving Joy pieces of their mind, telling her exactly what they thought of her behavior. One woman shouted, "You should be ashamed of yourself. He's a national treasure and you treated him like garbage." Another audience member yelled, "I've been watching this show for years and I'm never watching again after what I just saw." The energy in the studio was electric with anger and disappointment. What should have been a pleasant interview with a Hollywood legend had turned into a complete disaster, and everyone knew exactly who was to blame. Producers were rushing around, trying to figure out damage control. The commercial break was running long, because nobody knew what to do next. How do you come back from something like this? How do you continue a show after your guest has walked off in disgust? Sarah turned to Joy, with tears still streaming down her face. Do you even feel bad about what you did? Do you have any remorse at all? Joy opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since the confrontation started, she seemed genuinely speechless. The reality of what she'd done was finally sinking in. She'd humiliated a respected icon on live television. She'd made her co-hosts look bad. She'd turned the audience against her. And worst of all, she'd been completely in the wrong. Sunny shook her head in disgust. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Whoopi was still pacing, her hands clenched into fists. We're going to have to address this when we come back. We're going to have to apologize. And Joy, you're going to have to be part of that apology whether you like it or not. I don't see why I should apologize, Joy muttered, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Because you were wrong, Sarah practically shouted. You were completely, totally, obviously wrong. Everyone in this studio knows it. Everyone watching at home is going to know it. The only person who doesn't seem to know it is you. The stage manager was giving them a countdown. 30 seconds until they were back on air. The hosts scrambled back to their seats, trying to compose themselves. Joy sat there looking stubborn and defensive. The others looked shaken and upset. When the cameras came back on, Whoopi took a deep breath and addressed the viewers directly. Welcome back to The View. As you all saw, we just had an unprecedented situation where our guest, Clint Eastwood, felt he needed to leave our show. And I want to say, on behalf of all of us, that we are deeply sorry for what happened. The audience applauded this, showing their support for Whoopi's words. What you witnessed was not representative of what we stand for on this show, Whoopi continued. We believe in having tough conversations. Yes. We believe in asking difficult questions. Absolutely. But we also believe in treating our guests with respect and dignity. And today, that didn't happen. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes again. Clint Eastwood is a legend in every sense of the word. He deserved better than what happened here today. And I'm so sorry that he had to experience that. Sunny added, we invited him here to talk about his work, to celebrate his achievements, and to have a meaningful dialogue. Instead, he was subjected to what can only be described as a personal attack. That's not okay. It's never okay. All eyes turned to Joy, waiting for her to add her own apology. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. The audience was watching her intently, waiting to see if she would take responsibility. Finally, Joy spoke, but her words were defensive rather than apologetic. I think we can all agree to disagree about what happened here today. The audience booed. Loudly. The disapproval was overwhelming. Whoopi closed her eyes, clearly frustrated. Sarah looked like she might start crying again. Sunny just shook her head in disbelief. Joy, Whoopi said carefully, that's not good enough. Well, it's going to have to be, Joy replied stubbornly. I'm not going to apologize for speaking my mind. The audience's boos got even louder. People were standing up again, shouting their disapproval. This was turning into a complete meltdown, and it was all being broadcast live to millions of viewers across the country. Whoopi made a decision. We're going to take another break, she announced to the camera. When we come back, we'll have a different discussion. The cameras cut again, and this time the confrontation between the hosts was even more intense. Whoopi was no longer trying to hide her anger. Joy, you need to leave the set. Right now. What? You can't kick me off my own show, Joy protested. Watch me, Whoopi replied, her voice deadly serious. You've embarrassed all of us. You've embarrassed yourself, and you're refusing to even acknowledge that you did anything wrong. So yes, I'm asking you to leave. Right now. The audience erupted in applause at Whoopi's words. People were cheering, showing their full support for this decision. Joy looked around desperately, but even she could see that she had no support. Not from her co-hosts, not from the audience, not from the crew. She'd alienated everyone with her behavior. "Fine," she said, standing up abruptly. "If that's how you all feel." "That's how we all feel," Sarah confirmed, her voice stronger now. "What you did was wrong, Joy. And until you can admit that, you don't belong at this table." Joy grabbed her notes and stormed off the set, her face burning with humiliation and anger. But unlike Clint's dignified exit, hers was marked by stomping feet and muttered complaints. The audience watched her go with satisfaction, glad to see her facing some kind of consequence for her actions. As the studio doors slammed behind Joy, the remaining hosts sat in stunned silence. The energy in the room had completely changed. The anger and tension were being replaced by a kind of exhausted relief. Whoopi looked at the audience and gave them a tired smile. Well, that was something. The audience laughed, the tension finally breaking. They applauded again, showing their appreciation for how Whoopi had handled an impossible situation. "I think we can all agree that today did not go as planned," Whoopi continued. "But I hope you all understand why we had to do what we just did. This show is about respect. It's about dialogue. It's about listening to different perspectives. And when someone violates those core principles, there have to be consequences." The audience gave her a standing ovation. They were behind her completely. Sarah spoke up, her voice still emotional, but more composed now. "I just want to say to anyone watching at home, especially to Clint Eastwood if he's watching, that we are truly, deeply sorry. You deserved so much better than what happened here today. You are a class act, and the grace you showed in the face of such disrespect was remarkable." Sonny nodded. "Absolutely. And I hope this serves as a reminder to all of us, in media and in life, that we can disagree with people without being disagreeable. We can challenge ideas without attacking the person. And we must always, always treat people with basic human decency." The audience applauded again, clearly moved by the sincerity of these words. Whoopi took a deep breath. "We're going to continue with the show, because that's what professionals do. But I think we all learned something important today. And I hope our viewers did too." As the show continued, the hosts tried their best to return to some sense of normalcy. But everyone in that studio knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. They'd seen a legend walk away with his dignity intact. They'd seen a host completely lose the support of her colleagues and her audience. They'd seen what happens when ego and disrespect collide with class and self-respect. Back in the dressing room area, Clint was preparing to leave the building. Staff members kept approaching him to apologize, to tell him they supported him, to express their disgust at how he'd been treated. He thanked each of them graciously, showing the same kindness that had marked his entire career. One young production assistant approached nervously. "Mr. Eastwood, I just want to say that I've admired your work my entire life. And what you did out there, standing up for yourself like that, it was incredible. You're my hero." Clint smiled at her, that famous Clint Eastwood smile that had lit up movie screens for decades. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's very kind. But I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who knows when it's time to walk away." "Still," she insisted, "you handled that with so much class. I would have lost my temper." "I almost did," Clint admitted, "but I've learned over the years that the best response to cruelty is calm dignity. Don't let them make you into something you're not." Those words would echo through the building as staff members shared the story of what Clint had said. It became a defining moment, a lesson in how to handle yourself when someone tries to tear you down. Meanwhile, back on set, the show was wrapping up. Whoopi, Sarah, and Sonny had managed to get through the rest of the episode, but the energy was subdued. Everyone was still processing what had happened. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience filed out, Many of them stopped to thank Whoopi for standing up to Joy. They expressed their disappointment in what had happened, but their appreciation for how it was ultimately handled. One older woman grabbed Whoopi's hand. "Thank you for defending that man. My husband and I have watched his movies together for 40 years. He's part of our lives. Seeing him treated that way was heartbreaking." Whoopi squeezed her hand. "I know. It was heartbreaking for us too." In the control room, producers were already dealing with the fallout. The phone lines were jammed with callers. Social media was exploding. Everyone was talking about what had happened on The View that day, and the overwhelming consensus was clear. Clint Eastwood had been wronged, and Joy Behar had been completely out of line. The show's executive producers called an emergency meeting. They knew this was going to be a major story. They knew they had to figure out how to respond to the public outcry. But most importantly, they knew they had to make things right, somehow. As for Clint, he left the building through a back exit, avoiding the media circus that was already gathering out front. He climbed into a waiting car and sat back, finally allowing himself to relax. It had been one of the most bizarre experiences of his long career, but he'd handled it the only way he knew how, with honesty, dignity, and self-respect. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Rough day, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint chuckled softly. "You could say that. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Nobody should have to sit there and take that kind of treatment." "Thank you," Clint replied. "I appreciate that." As the car pulled away from the studio, Clint looked out the window at the city passing by. He thought about all the interviews he'd done over the decades, all the talk shows he'd appeared on, all the conversations he'd had with hosts and journalists and fans. This had been the strangest, by far. But in a way, it had also been clarifying. It reminded him why he'd gotten into this business in the first place, to tell stories about people with integrity, people who stood up for what was right, people who didn't let bullies push them around. And today, he'd lived those values himself. Back at the studio, the aftermath continued. Joy had retreated to her dressing room, still insisting she'd done nothing wrong, still refusing to see how badly she'd messed up. But everyone else could see it clearly. The producers, the other hosts, the crew, the audience. They all knew that something had gone terribly wrong, and they all knew whose fault it was. Whoopi sat in her dressing room, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. Sarah knocked on the door and came in, still looking shaken. "How are you doing?" Sarah asked. Whoopi sighed. "I've had better days. You?" "I keep replaying it in my head," Sarah admitted. "I keep thinking about what we could have done differently, how we could have stopped it before it got that bad." "We tried," Whoopi reminded her. "We all tried to step in, but Joy was determined to have her moment. And now, we're all paying for it." Sunny joined them a moment later. The phones won't stop ringing. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen next. What are we going to say? "The truth," Whoopi replied firmly. "We're going to tell the truth. Joy was wrong. We should have stopped her sooner. And we're sorry. That's all we can do." The three women sat together in silence for a moment, united in their shared disappointment and determination to make things right. They knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, more questions, more fallout. But for now, they just needed a moment to process what had been one of the most difficult days in the show's history. Out in the parking lot, crew members gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd witnessed. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had something to say. But the consensus was universal. Clint Eastwood had been treated unfairly, and Joy Behar had shown her true colors. "I've worked on this show for 8 years, one camera operator said, "and I've never seen anything like that. Never seen a host go after a guest like that for no reason." "She's always been opinionated," another crew member replied. But this was different. This was personal, like she had an axe to grind and decided to use Clint as her target. Well, it backfired spectacularly, a third person chimed in. Did you see the audience? They were ready to riot. I've never seen an audience turn on a host like that. Good, the first camera operator said firmly. She deserved it. What she did was inexcusable. As the sun set on that dramatic day, the full impact of what had happened was just beginning to be understood. News outlets were picking up the story. Entertainment websites were publishing articles. Social media was ablaze with reactions and opinions. Everyone was talking about the day Clint Eastwood walked off The View. But more importantly, everyone was talking about why he walked off. And in those discussions, in those debates, in those endless social media threads, a clear narrative emerged. Clint Eastwood had been the victim of an unprovoked attack, and he'd responded with the kind of dignity and grace that had defined his entire career. Joy Behar, on the other hand, had revealed something ugly about herself. She'd shown that she was willing to ambush a guest, willing to insult a legend, willing to put her own ego above basic decency. And the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict swiftly and decisively. She was in the wrong. As night fell and the studio finally emptied out, the events of the day took on an almost surreal quality. It seemed impossible that so much could have gone wrong in such a short amount of time. It seemed impossible that a routine interview could have exploded into such a dramatic confrontation. But it had happened, and everyone who witnessed it, whether in the studio or watching at home, would remember it for years to come. They would remember Clint's calm in the face of hostility. They would remember Joy's shocking rudeness. They would remember Whoopi's attempt to maintain control. They would remember the audience's unified support for the wronged guest. Most of all, they would remember the moment when Clint stood up, removed his microphone, and walked away. That image of dignity in the face of disrespect would become iconic. It would be replayed countless times. It would be discussed and analyzed and held up as an example of how to handle yourself when someone tries to tear you down. Because in that moment, Clint Eastwood didn't just walk off a talk show. He walked away from toxicity. He walked away from disrespect. He walked away from someone who valued confrontation over conversation, ego over empathy, scoring points over human decency. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching what true class looks like. He reminded them that you don't have to engage with people who come at you with bad intentions. He reminded them that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's ugliness. The View would go on. The show would continue. But it would never be quite the same after that day. The day a legend was disrespected and decided he'd had enough. The day Joy Behar learned that actions have consequences. The day everyone was reminded that no matter how famous you are, no matter how big your platform is, treating people with basic human decency is not optional. It was a lesson that resonated far beyond the walls of that television studio. It was a lesson about respect, about dignity, about knowing when to walk away. And it was a lesson delivered by a man who had spent his entire career playing characters who embodied those same values. In the end, Clint Eastwood didn't need to make a speech or throw insults or lower himself to Joy's level. He simply stood up and left. And that simple action spoke louder than any words could have. It said, "I know my worth. I know I don't deserve this, and I won't sit here and accept it." That message, that powerful statement of self-respect, would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience went home.